And we are back. Welcome back, everybody. Today we're looking at Chapter 10, Section 5, Part 1, The War of 1812. I decided to split this lesson into 2 days because it's kind of hard to talk about an entire war in just one day, and there's a lot of information here, so we're going to split this up over the next couple of days and then hopefully learn a little bit about the United States' second War for Independence. And specifically today and tomorrow, our essential question will be, what is the historical significance of the War of 1812? And as you can see, like always, I've already done an audio recording for today's lesson, and if you choose to use those audio recordings, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, let's take a look at our key terms for today. Our key terms will be the Battle of Lake Erie, the Battle of New Orleans, the Hartford Convention, and the Treaty of Ghent. Some of these we will talk about today, and some of them we'll actually talk about tomorrow, but I want you to be familiar that those are really the two main battles that I'm going to want you to understand and be able to come away with something from this lesson. So the Battle of Lake Erie, New Orleans, the Hartford Convention, and the Treaty of Ghent. Some we will talk about today, some we'll talk about tomorrow. But as we get into this, I want you to get into your best thinking spot, like Pooh and Piglet here, and think back to the previous lesson. What do you think the United States would gain from going to war with Great Britain in 1812? And on the flip side, what might the country lose? Do you think that war was inevitable, which just means that it's unable to be avoided? Or do you think they should have tried harder to keep the peace? Keep in mind that a lot of people were pushing for war, especially the push that people were getting from the war hawks, which we studied yesterday. But did we have to listen to those guys? I mean, we're talking about a small group of people that were very, very loud, but still a fairly small amount of the American public. And as we move into today's lesson and as we watch our first video, I want you to keep in mind that there's always a choice.
The USS Constitution, America's most famous warship, now sits in Boston Harbor, a testament to the valor and skill of a fledgling U.S. Navy, born in the last decade of the 18th century. In 1793, Britain and France once again went to war. On the high seas, neither side respected United States neutrality. It was clear that America needed a military to protect its frontiers, as well as unfettered trade and commercial shipping interests. While the Army and militia primarily functioned on an as-needed basis, a Navy required permanent ships, officers, and crew. In 1794, Congress authorized the establishment of a Navy with the building of 6 frigates. The first of these ships, the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides because bullets bounced off its tough oak planking, was launched from Boston Harbor in 1797. The ship carried 50 guns and a crew of more than 450. This small beginning of the American Navy would have tremendous payoffs in the War of 1812. The Constitution would be involved in 2 classic battles between British ships, winning both. Other American ships also defeated the British warships, and bolstering the morale of the American Navy and enhancing its reputation. Britain, the country of Drake and Nelson, had her nose bloodied by the infant United States Navy. America's modern military was completed by the establishment of the Marine Corps in 1798. The Corps would serve gloriously through the next 200 years. As the 18th century came to an end, the U.S. military was poised to protect America's frontier as well as commerce throughout the world.
Now, during the early days of the war, the United States was nowhere near ready for its first war as a new nation when Congress officially declared war in 1812. And they were nowhere near ready to be fighting against the highly trained British Army and Navy. If you remember, one of the things that President Jefferson wanted to do when he got into office was to reduce the size of the Army and the Navy. Well, he did that. He reduced the size of the military, and the United States was only left with 16 ships against the enormous and very powerful British fleet. And the army itself was pretty small, and its leaders really knew very little about actual real-life warfare. So with very few regular troops, the army relied on volunteers, which these volunteers had been attracted with the promise of land and these large salaries, but they were very poorly trained, and after a few months, a lot of them just ran off and deserted. Strike one. So the United States only had 16 ships, so that put Great Britain at a pretty big advantage when it came to fighting on the high seas. So the British were able to use their much larger, more powerful navy to blockade American ports to try and stop trade. And even though the American Navy wasn't able to fully break the blockade, some American sea captains were able to gain some victories fairly early on. And one very, very famous battle took place near Newfoundland in August of 1812 between the USS Constitution, which we're looking at right here, nicknamed Old Ironsides, and the British ship, the HMS Guerre. So the Constitution surprised the other ship by shooting off both of its masts, and which forced the British to surrender. And it was this victory and other naval victories really helped to cheer up the American public, but they really didn't do a whole lot to win the actual war. So these were more like think of them as moral victories. They got the public excited, and they were like, you know what, we can hang with these guys. But as far as like impacting the actual war, they really didn't do a whole lot. All right, so you remember how I asked you to get into your best thinking spot and think? Well, if you remember, one of the large goals for the Warhawks was to conquer Canada. And that was one of their goals because they were convinced that the Canadians would love to do away with British rule just like American colonists had done. And so they would think that Canada would do away with British rule and join with the United States. So American General William Hull moved troops north from Detroit against a small Canadian force led by a very clever British general, Isaac Brock. And what Brock did was that he dressed the Canadians up as British regulars, the Redcoats, and convinced the Americans that the Indians were also fighting for them, which caused Hull to then retreat from Canada. And there were some other attempts to try and invade Canada, but those also failed. And if we think back to the American War for Independence, when General Cornwallis based the entire British plans on moving into the South and based his strategy on loyalist support. Remember that? Yeah, it didn't really work out for him either. Only this time, the roles are reversed. Which brings us to the Battle of Lake Erie, one of the two major battles that I want to discuss and that we're going to talk about today. So, in 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry, which, by the way, is one of the most awesome names for a naval captain, and ultimately a naval commodore, Perry was the commander of the American ships on Lake Erie, and his mission was to gain naval superiority on the lake. So to accomplish that mission, Perry had to first increase the number of ships he had, so he designed and built two new brigs, which he called the Lawrence and the Niagara, and each one weighed 500 pounds and was armed with 18 32-pound cannons and two long-range 12-pound cannons. So he built these two ships, and he had also captured the Chalcedonia along with 7 schooners. So Perry, first things first, he had to build up his navy, and he did that by capturing ships as well as building these two ships, the Lawrence and the Niagara. So he sailed his fleet from Presque Isle, or Erie, Pennsylvania, in early August 1813. And even though Perry's fleet was smaller, the British and Americans both now had very capable fleets on Lake Erie. And on September 10th, 1813, the British decided to engage the American fleet that was anchored at South Bass Island. Now, the Americans had the advantage in terms of the number and weight of their guns, and after hours of sailing, the two fleets were within shooting distance, and the Americans swiftly closed in to take advantage of their better short-range cannons. Now, the British had better long-range cannons, but the Americans had better short-range cannons, so they swooped in to try and take advantage of that. And Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, awesome name, was in command aboard the Lawrence. And there, for a period during the battle, the Niagara, which was Lawrence's other ship, or the sister ship to the Lawrence, was not fully engaged. It wasn't really a part of the battle. It was in a position where it couldn't fully take advantage of either its long or its short range guns. And so Perry on the Lawrence was outgunned at that point, and while the Lawrence did its best, gave as well as it got, it was soon barely seaworthy. So Perry and his men abandoned that to board the Niagara. And once Perry was safely aboard the Niagara, the Lawrence struck her colors, and a short cheer went up from the battered British fleet. And struck her colors means that they took down, showing that they were out of the battle. But it was after that, so the British thought, all right, we're winning this thing, we've got this. But then the Niagara bore down on them, and in short order, the British were forced to surrender. And Perry then went on to report his famous words, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," which is just, it just gives me chills. That is such an awesome phrase. It was basically saying, like, yeah, we met the enemy. We got this. So after losing Lake Erie, the British and their Native American allies retreated from Detroit up into Canada. And General William Henry Harrison, as in the famous general from the Battle of Tippecanoe, pursued them and won a decisive victory at the Battle of the Thames. So 50 miles east of Detroit, British General Proctor, along with Tecumseh, decided to make their stand. And the location was along the Thames River, and Proctor picked a location where his lines were very long. They weren't very deep. Remember that. The lines were very long. So when American scouts reported that the British lines had to cover a very long area, which meant the lines were very thin, Harrison decided on a very daring strategy, a cavalry assault by his troops directly on the British lines. And the British were not prepared for this type of assault, and the first wave of cavalry very quickly rode through their lines and then turned on them from the rear. So the cavalry broke through the British lines and then doubled back and started attacking them from behind. And when a second line surrounded them from the front, most of the British troops quickly surrendered. And the American forces went on to defeat the Indian allies, killing most of them, including Tecumseh. And that is where I'm going to stop for today. I know this was a little bit shorter, but it's going to set us up for all of the awesome stuff we're going to discuss tomorrow. So remember, from today, the American Army and Navy had been severely depleted, so they had to try and build that up very quickly, and that didn't work out so well. But the Americans were able to gain some victories in Battle of Lake Erie, Battle of the Thames. So there are some naval victories, some ground victories, but we will continue our discussion tomorrow. And at the end of the day tomorrow, we're going to be looking at something that I want you to kind of keep in the back of your minds as we go through talking about the War of 1812. Is that, do you think that the War of 1812 should have even been fought in the first place? And there are arguments that can be made for both sides, so I want you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind as we go through, especially go through tomorrow's lesson and find out the results of the War of 1812 and the Treaty of Ghent. But like always, if you have any questions, please come and find me. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to our discussion tomorrow.